Hi, I'm Will Randolph. Welcome back to this video series of The Deepest Revolution, Co-Creating a Healthy Nation. Today's theme is living in reciprocity with a gift economy. And to put today's video in context of the whole series, session one, or video one, was an introduction to healthy nations, right? Are all humans really the same and, we all have similar nations? Or are there really profoundly different ways of life that allows some people to live without corruption and greed, and other people just have endless corruption and greed, no matter what we try and do? And I believe that there really are very different ways of life. And in that first video, it was more of a survey, right? What are some common patterns, right? All these healthy nations in traditional times are very different in their own ways. But if we dig deeper into this way of life, we see these beautiful common patterns. And in today's video, we're going to be going deeper into one aspect of this, which is having a way of life where sharing is normal. And in the third video, the theme will be high standards. How can we make trustworthy behavior normal so that trust can be normal too in our communities and ultimately in the healthy nation? And then in video 4, the theme is pathways to a healthy nation, right? Other people have been trapped in this way of life too, right? With endless sexism and discrimination, racism, greed, child abuse for centuries. And yet they came together and they built a new healthy nation that allowed them to live without those problems, right? So in session 4, I'll be sharing those stories to show what path we could walk that could let us build a healthy nation ourselves. So each session will start on its own with a review, and these videos are available at my website, thedeepestrevolution.com/videos. So to give an overview of today's video and the major sections, we'll start with a review, right? If you haven't seen the first video, that's totally okay. And if you have, well, welcome back, and we'll give a little refresher that will seem familiar, right? How are healthy nations different in traditional times? What is it about this way of life that really makes it worth learning about? And what I believe is that in unhealthy nations, we're trapped with selfishness. And actually, selfishness is encouraged in a lot of different ways. And what I believe is that if we're really going to understand this beautiful way of life of healthy nations in traditional times, we first have to understand our own way of life and how it keeps us trapped in these terrible patterns of corruption. And then once we've looked a little bit at our own way of life, I'd love to spend most of this video looking at this beautiful way of life. What's it like to live in reciprocity, right? Where everyone in the community or everyone in the whole nation shares with each other and moves resources from the haves to the have-nots. I'll show all these beautiful stories that I've found. And again, all these healthy nations are different, but these different stories and perspectives, they show some common patterns, right? So it's not about copying anything. It's about learning the lessons and seeing how we can live them out, how we can make these patterns real in our own lives to build a healthy nation. So to start off with the review, in the first video, I asked, what is a totally trustworthy person like? If you could imagine someone that is totally trustworthy in every way, what qualities would they need to show in order for you to believe they're totally trustworthy? One of them is integrity, and that has a lot of parts. Always tell the truth, always keeping your promises, right? If someone is totally trustworthy, right, they would tell the truth and they would always keep their promises, right? If someone only thinks about themselves and how they can get richer or how they can take advantage, well, that's not very trustworthy, right? So acting in service is something that we expect of someone that we totally trust, right? If I'm being disrespected, if someone's insulting me or taking advantage of me somehow, right? This totally trustworthy person, they wouldn't just mind their own business, right? They would help me out. They would confront injustice. They would stand for what's right, right? And this totally trustworthy person, they would not just tell the truth or keep their promises when they feel like it or when it's easy, right? They would tell the truth no matter what. They would confront injustice no matter what. And so even if it's scary or uncomfortable, they're doing the right thing, which is an example of bravery. As another example, if I'm being physically attacked by somebody or robbed, then what would this totally trustworthy person do? Well, they would protect me, right? They wouldn't just let me suffer alone. And so protecting me from danger is another aspect of being totally trustworthy. And we talked about generosity, right? Sharing. If this person never shares at all and they're only taking or being neutral, right? Well, what if I'm in need? What if I'm hungry and I don't have food or money? Well, they would share with me, right? And it's not just that they would share, right? They also receive, right? Because I want to give back to the people that give to me. And if they never received, well, we couldn't have reciprocity. And it would be hard to have a deep relationship. And so reciprocity is its own kind, like aspect of being totally trustworthy, right? So question, what happens if rumors are flying around, right? Maybe people you know and some people you don't know are telling stories about you that aren't totally true. And you can't control what they say, and you can't control what people believe, right? So if this has ever happened to you, you know that you can kind of feel helpless in this situation because, again, you can't control what they do. But if a totally trustworthy person heard the stories, would they just believe the stories and suddenly stop talking to you? Or would they come to you and find out the truth for themselves, right? Not just blindly believing what you say, but really investigating to decide for themselves what's true, right? I believe that is something they would do. And so awareness or seeking the truth is an aspect of trustworthy behavior. And now, no one's perfect. I'm not perfect. No one's perfect, right? Even the most trustworthy person in the world makes mistakes sometimes, right? But what would they do when they make a mistake? If they broke a promise, say, well, they would take accountability, right? They would acknowledge the broken promise. They would figure out what harm was done, right, when they broke it, and they would try to make it better, and they would promise not to let it happen again, right? So they would take accountability, which is another aspect of being trustworthy. What happens if I make a mistake? What if I break a promise and let this trustworthy person down? Would they just wash their hands of me and say, well, I know what kind of person you are, and I don't want anything to do with you? Or if I take accountability, I acknowledge what I did, I apologize, I try to make up for any harm done, and I promise not to let it happen again. Would they see my personal growth? Would they see that I'm a good person doing my best and I made a mistake, but I learned from it? Right. They would have compassion. They would see my humanity and they would resume trusting me as I show that I'm trustworthy when I take accountability. Another thing, what happens if I am really in a not doing well personally? Maybe I'm in a relationship that's bad for me, or I'm doing drugs, right, in a self-destructive way, or I'm failing out of school. Would this trustworthy person just let me self-destruct, or would they lift me up? Would they build my self-confidence and help me see that I could build a better life for myself than I am? I believe a totally trustworthy person would lift me up. And what's another example? If this person were spent most of their life drinking alcohol and was mostly drunk all the time, or maybe they spent all their free time playing video games or having superficial conversations about sports, right? Would that person be deeply trustworthy? Not to me, right? To me, what if they walked the most meaningful path that they could, right? They were living a meaningful life where everything they did mattered to them. It's not that you're serious all the time, right? You're having fun, you're enjoying life, but what you're doing matters to you. You're acting in service of what you care about, right? So I believe that that's another aspect of trustworthiness, right? That you're living a meaningful life. And I'm sure we could make a longer list, right? But I think this is a good start, right? If someone embraced all these qualities, then I think that that would be a darn good start at being a totally trustworthy person. So a question for you. If you wanted to have a friend that was this trustworthy, what kind of friend would you need to be? That's right. You'd need to be that kind of friend too, right? That kind of trustworthy friend in order to have a friend like that. And if you need to treat someone else the way you want to be treated, what does that sound like? That's the golden rule, right? To treat others the way I want to be treated. And I believe that's what human trust is. Our desire to trust another person is actually our desire to trust that they will live by the golden rule in all the ways that means, right? All these ways that we're talking about here. So you could imagine how amazing it would feel to know a single person that you trust that much. Maybe some viewers know a person or two. And if you don't, you could imagine how amazing it would feel to know someone like this. And now imagine everyone in your community you trust this much, wherever you go, whichever house you stop at, right? And now imagine everyone in your nation, when you leave your community and you go to another one, you can trust the people there just as much, right? So if we're going to have a whole nation of people where this level of trust is normal, what way of life would we need to have this trust in our neighbors and leaders? It would need to be a way of life where everyone in the nation fully embraces the golden rule, right? And that means that we're not just allowed to share with each other. We are expected to share with each other. You're not just allowed to confront injustice. Everyone is expected to confront injustice. Sounds cool, right? Well, Jeanette Armstrong is an Okanagan woman, and she was describing their traditional decision-making process and other aspects of their traditional way of life. And she described it this way. She said, "The realization that people and community are there to sustain you creates the most secure feeling in the world. When that happens, you're imbued with the hope that others surrounding you in your community can provide." And when she says most secure feeling in the world, I believe that that's comparable to that feeling of deep trust that we were just talking about when we can be surrounded by deeply trustworthy people. And she gave this talk in the early 2000s, I believe, and it was collected in this book called The Original Instructions. And she described how the Okanagans were able to maintain this traditional way of life until just a few generations ago, right? So this isn't just ancient history 10,000 years ago. People are able to live this way right now or in recent times within just a few generations ago. So if we look at healthy nations around the world in traditional times, right, when they can choose how to live, they have a lot of differences. They have different clothes, they have different food, they have different songs and creation stories, right? There's a lot of differences. But if we look at the way of life, like what are the real basics that these all have in common that allow them to avoid the corruption and the greed? What are those basics that allow them to live by the golden rule? And I've studied several dozen of these, and I want to share the common patterns that I've found. One is that everyone ensures the laws work for everybody. Solidarity and mutual aid are normal. And everyone is expected to protect and share with each other. And that means everyone is expected to confront injustice. And leaders are fully accountable to the people. So examples of nations with this way of life are the Ashaninka, the Apache, and Potawatomi. The Ashaninka I got to live with briefly in 2015, and I got to see them living in this traditional way. I got to see it and experience it myself, and it totally changed my life. It showed me that a different way of life really is possible. The Apache and Potawatomi, people of these nations are alive today. They're not able to embrace this traditional way of life, and we can get later into why that is. But people carry on traditional knowledge and practices as best they can from what it was like when they're able to fully embrace this way of life. And people like me, if we're willing to go listen to them, we can learn what this way of life is like and lessons that could help us embrace it ourselves. So these people are also called Indians or Native or Indigenous people. And in Australia, they're called Aborigines. In Canada, they're called First Nations. And I call them free nations when they're able to live in traditional times. So if there's this beautiful way of life where people can live by the golden rule, how come there's this terrible way of life with endless corruption and greed, no matter who we vote for, no matter what skin color we are, no matter where in the world we live, right? What is it about this way of life? If we look at unhealthy nations around the world, Russia, China, United States, Switzerland, Japan, like all these different unhealthy nations, what is it that they all have in common that caused them all to experience these same terrible kinds of problems? Well, a few people choose the laws and to choose how they're enforced, right? Maybe you have a king that makes the laws or an emperor, or maybe you vote every so often and corrupt politicians go into office and then they make whatever laws, right? And then the authorities enforce the laws and everyone else obeys. We are not allowed to enforce the laws we obey, right? It's the police's job to enforce the law. It's not our job. And in fact, we are forbidden from enforcing the laws that we have to obey. And that means we are forbidden to confront injustice, right? We can stand around waving signs. We can write letters to the editor. We can do all these things. But we are not allowed to physically intervene to confront injustice. And that means in unhealthy nations, it is actually illegal to fully embrace the golden rule. Excuse me. So examples of this with this way of life are Russia, Ecuador, the United States, and Japan. And I also call the unhealthy nations civilized or unfree nations. And this gets to the heart of what freedom means, right? Freedom doesn't mean you can do whatever you want, right? That's a very selfish perspective. Freedom, I believe, is a way of life where sharing is normal, right? And so where everyone shares, so sharing is normal, right? Freedom is a way of life where everyone takes responsibility to confront injustice so that justice is normal. So freedom is a way of life where everyone in the nation lives out the golden rule, right? And so when we look at healthy nations in traditional times, or what most people call Indians or indigenous during traditional times, I believe that shows us how humans can live in freedom together. And in order to understand what this way of life is like, I first want to look a little bit at what our way of life is like, because if we can understand the trap we're in and how we're trained to accept this way of life as normal, it can help us recognize the value of this beautiful way of life and learn the deepest lessons from it. So I believe unhealthy nations, whether it's communist or capitalist, democracy or monarchy, have this deep problem in common, that we are trained for selfishness. And I want to go through these different, at a really high level, groups of people, right, different classes, and show these different pressures we're under that train us for selfishness. And I want to start by talking about poor people, people without many resources. And the poor people, if we just look at their situation, they try to survive, right? They can barely afford to pay enough for food, medical care, housing, transport, living on the edge, sometimes not enough, trying to beg and scrap and do whatever they need to do to take care of themselves and their family. They're trying to avoid abuse, right? They may live with pollution in the dirty parts of town, right? They may have a heavy police presence or a lot of crime. They may have disrespectful bosses, right? All these different problems that they're trying to avoid as they try and survive, right? And this leads to a sense of desperation when you don't have enough and you need to scrap for a job to make ends meet. This one woman named Didi is an American sex worker, and she gave an interview in 2018, and she said, if I can't get a job, I still got to feed myself. That's the constant scenario that's always going on in your mind. Where am I going to eat? Where am I going to sleep? How am I going to get some clothes? You cannot even think anywhere past that because it takes all of that just to live. When you don't have a job, you don't have insurance, right? So people can act selfishly or, make decisions they don't want to make, not because they want to take advantage of people, but because they're trapped in desperation. And I haven't interviewed Dee Dee. I don't want to put words in her mouth. But I'm going to guess, as a sex worker, that she has sex with people she probably doesn't really want to have sex with. But she's doing this, like she says, because she's still got to feed herself, right? So this is the desperation that can cause many people to make decisions they don't really want to make. So moving up the ladder a little bit to a different tier, we have the professionals and the managers who, when we really look at this way of life, this aspect of it, they're trying to avoid the abuses that the poor face, right? They're trying to keep a regular income so they don't have the insecurity of knowing whether they'll pay their rent at the end of the month. They want to save for emergencies. They want to live in a safe neighborhood, not the crime-ridden neighborhood, right? They want to avoid the pollution. They want nutritious food. They want to get kids into good schools or have respectful bosses, or maybe be their own boss, right? If they start a small business, right? So in a society where there's tons of abuse and corruption and greed all around, they're basically maintaining their comfort and safety. So let's talk about the rich. And there are a lot of different ways of looking at these different classes. But one of the biggest issues I see is that they benefit from corruption and abuse, right? So if the factory cuts corners, right? The factory owner cuts corners and there's tons of smog going into the air because they decided not to pay for the smog cleaning equipment. Who benefits from that? Well, the factory owner gets a little bit richer, and it's the rest of the people that suffer from the pollution, right? If corrupt politicians don't enforce the law on the factory owner, who benefits, right? It's the rich, right? While the rest of the society suffers for it, right? If there's dishonest media that covers up the problem or, spreads lies or causes people to be angry with each other, who benefits, right? The rich. If most of us want lower rent, right? But who wants higher rent? Well, the people that own the apartment buildings and the houses, the rich. And so we might want not to have needless or unjust wars, right? But the people that own the weapons companies, that own the banks, that own, all the contractors that support the war industry, right? They benefit from it, and they can get really rich with every unjust war. And what that means is we have people in our own society who benefit from corruption. And that means that we have people in our own society who are threatened by solidarity, right? Threatened by anti-corruption movements, right? Unions, right? Workers trying to come together to build better working conditions, right? Well, who suffers? The business owner, right? That's money out of their pocket. That's political power they don't have, right? Who suffers from the environmental movements? Well, the rich who are profiting off of destroying the environment. Who loses out when the minimum wage rises? The people who have to pay higher wages and be a little bit less rich, right? Who doesn't like the anti-war movement, right? The people who profit massively. And so we have this tension in our society. Mostly when people think of enemies, they think of some foreign country's army approaching, right? And if we all band together, we can stop the enemy, right? But in unhealthy nations, there's this deep tension because some people benefit from corruption and most people want it to stop. And I'm not the first person to notice this. People have noticed this deep division for thousands of years, right? Jesus Christ was a Jewish spiritual leader and social activist. And in about 30 CE, he said, if a kingdom is divided against itself, it cannot stand, right? He was noticed the deep division. John Ball was an English social activist. In 1381, he said, nothing will be well in England until we are in the same condition, right? We can't have people benefiting from corruption and people who want it to stop in the same society. Abraham Lincoln, an American political leader in 1858, he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand, right? He was echoing Jesus Christ, making the same point. And so for a long time, people have recognized something's wrong, right? We have this deep division. And that selfishness, right, when people are trained for selfishness, it shows up in really weird ways that are hard to understand, hard to talk to each other about, and have productive political conversations. And one reason is something that Upton Sinclair described. He said, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." That's crazy, right? That means people are ignoring reality to keep their jobs, right? We're sacrificing our integrity to keep the job that allows us to put food on the table. So what does that mean? That means we don't just have corruption in the the politicians, right? It means corruption is widespread. Coal miners insist climate change isn't happening. Why? Because if they acknowledge climate change, they might not have a job anymore, right? Weapons makers ignore the injustice of needless wars, because if we only had wars that were really important to have to protect our people from from other conquering countries, we'd have a lot fewer wars, right? Economists promote endless growth while ignoring the environmental and physical limits. Prison guards guard inmates whether they're guilty or not, right? If you're in jail because a judge was corrupt, because a police officer decided not to tell the full truth on the stand, maybe your state appointed lawyer decided they didn't really care about your case. Tough luck. That's not my job as a a prison guard. I'm going to keep you in this cage anyway, right? So pro athletes advertise for addictive gambling apps that hurt their fans. CEOs give themselves big pay raises while laying off workers. Farmers overdraw groundwater. And I'll acknowledge, I have a grandfather. Before he died, he was a farmer. I have a huge amount of respect for farmers, especially the small-time farmers. And when you talk to the farmers, they'll tell you we shouldn't be doing this, right? People know water is a limited resource, and I got to put food on the table now. In order to do that, I have to sell food now, which means I have to grow food and use the water now, right? They are trapped in a way of life that causes them to make short-term decisions, right? Using up this precious water because we're continually in this survival mode that forces us to make these decisions. Software developers ignore the harms of social media, screen addiction, and all these other kinds of problems that people have online. Chemical engineers ignore the harms of plastics, forever chemicals, pesticides, right? And we could keep making this list go as long as we wanted to. This is a way of life that traps us in a situation where we're making decisions that if we were really coming from wisdom and if we were coming from a place of security, we wouldn't make these decisions, but we're trapped, right? And this is a way of life, but we could live differently. So how can we co-create a healthy nation? Well, I believe the first step is to find inspirational examples. How have others lived this way, right? We can't build this way of life if we don't know what it's even like, right? So let's learn the practical lessons from these stories. And then with these lessons, let's build deep trust relationships with each other, build the friend groups, build the communities, and then bring the communities together to build a nation, right? Where people trust each other and are closely connected with the earth. And in the fourth video, we'll go into a lot more detail on what that's like. But right now, I want to acknowledge some skepticism a lot of people have. Is it really possible for everyone in a whole nation to take responsibility to live by the golden rule? And to look at this, I want to invite my girlfriend, Shayna, to join me. All right. Thank you for joining me, Shayna. So to really look into if it's possible for whole nations of people to embrace the golden rule and to share with each other, to take responsibility to share, I want to talk about Indian givers. So I'm curious to ask you, when you were young and you heard about an Indian giver, what did that mean?
Means you give somebody a gift and then you take it back or ask for it back later.
Yeah, right? So you give me something and I'm really grateful that you gave me this gift. And then later you come and ask for it back, right? Well, and that sounds really selfish, doesn't it?
Terrible.
Terrible. Who would do something
Why
like
would you
that?
do that?
Right? It's mine and it was nice to give it to me, but it's like undoing the gift, right? And so it's totally reasonable, right, to think that that's inappropriate and to tell the person you shouldn't do that, right? Right. Well, I believe this is actually one of the biggest misunderstandings in the history of all history. It's one of the biggest I've ever heard of. And the funny thing is, everyone involved agrees that an Indian giver is giving a gift and asking for it back. But different people have different perspectives on whether that's okay or not, right? So I think you and I would agree, right? If someone, we'll talk about our perspective, this perspective that we grew up with first, right? If you give me a gift, it's mine, right? Right? And it's my property now. And it's rude to ask for it back, and I can do what I want, right? And in fact, I don't even want to give it back because since it's selfish to ask for it, I don't want to give a gift to a selfish person, right? And so what's the sort of the background attitude here, right? I'm trying to save wealth because I don't trust people around me to share. And so when I get something, I want to hold on to it. And so the background attitude is I don't trust people to share. And in unhealthy nations, right, the colonial British and the French and the Spanish, and the Portuguese and all the others, people are trained for selfishness or distrust. But what if it turned out that this person wasn't trying to take it back for themselves? Could that change what the story is actually about? Well, let's look at the healthy nation perspective. What were Indian givers actually trying to do? And I'm curious to hear if you hear what the healthy nation, what the Indian giver was actually trying to accomplish, if you'd have a different perspective on whether that was okay or not. So let's look at what an Indian giver is actually trying to do in all these different times for the last few hundreds of years that people have been called Indian givers. Well, when you have a way of life based on sharing, an Indian giver is not just sharing because they feel like it, right? They're actually taking responsibility to give a gift where they think it would be used. And they're taking responsibility when they see you're not using it to realize that and consider where else the gift could be better used, right? So they're noticing the gift is unused. And they're wondering, oh, if that's just hanging out in your storage shed, maybe you're not really using it, right? And maybe someone else could use it more. If you have food rotting in your pantry, well, and someone's hungry over here, I bet that I could help, right? And it wouldn't hurt you at all because you're not using it, right? It's a totally different story all of a sudden, right? Which means, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. The person is honoring the gift by moving it to the greatest good, right? If I'm going to pull an apple from a tree, if I'm going to harvest a fish from the sea, or if I'm going to build a house, or like whatever I'm doing, I want to put it to its greatest good and not let it rot or just go to waste, right? And so what the Indian giver is doing is actually really generous because they're not taking it back for themselves. They're actually trying to move that thing to where it could do the most good. And they're actually going to extra effort to notice whether it's being used and then try and get it to a better place. And so it's actually generous and responsible, but at a level that's so different because of this way of life that a lot of us are used to, that it just doesn't even register. And so a question for you, right? If we see this as misunderstood generosity, how different would it be if someone from one of these societies offered you something and saw you weren't using it and asked for it back so they could pass it on?
That makes sense.
Makes sense, doesn't
Yeah.
it? And what if you were part of one of these societies where you could feel comfortable giving up this thing that's yours, knowing that it's going to a good use and that other people are sharing too. And so whenever you're in need, someone will bring something back to you.
Yeah.
It makes it a lot easier to give that thing back, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Totally. And so it makes sense how if people are living in this way of life, this Indian giver, this giving something and asking for it back, it's the same action, but it can mean something totally different. And it shows how different these ways of life are, where for centuries, a lot of people still think an Indian giver is being selfish, which is crazy, right? One of the things I find really tragically funny is that both sides can be upset with the other side, right? Both sides will think the other person is being selfish, right? Because people like you and me, before we knew better, I'll speak for myself, I would think that the Indian giver is being selfish, right? Because you gave this thing to me and now you want it back, and that's selfish, right? But the Indian giver, they actually think I'm selfish because they gave me a gift. I'm not using it. They see that someone else could use it, and now I won't give it back, right? So we both think the other person is selfish because of how we've been trained in this way of life. Is that crazy? It's crazy. All right. And one of my favorite quotes comes from about this comes from Robin Kimmerer, right? She wrote this book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She's a Potawatomi woman. And she said, if all the world is a commodity, how poor we grow. When all the world is a gift in motion, how wealthy we become, right? So if the gifts keep moving, then we can all have wealth together. Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank you very much for joining me. Yeah. So the fact that people have had this misunderstanding about Indian giving for centuries shows that it's not just one nation or maybe two nations living this way. It really is a different way of life, right? A way of life that, if you don't know better, can be really confusing. And one of the really common patterns that I see in healthy nations in traditional times is that they have gift economies that reward sharing, right? Again, because people are taking responsibility to share, to move things where they do the most good. Ohiesa was a Dakota Sioux man in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and he was raised in a traditional way before later integrating into the United States. And he described that traditional way of life, and he said, during the summer, when nature is at her best and provides abundantly for the Indian, it seems to me that no life is happier than his. Food is free, lodging free, everything free. All were alike rich in the summer, and again, all were alike poor in the winter and early spring, right? So everyone's wealth rises together and falls together because people share no matter what, right? Nancy Baskett is a woman of Cherokee descent, and she described the traditional Cherokee way of life very similarly. She said, if we all had a lot, then everybody had a lot. If there wasn't a whole lot, then no one had a whole lot, right? It's the same thing. Our wealth rises and falls together because sharing is normal. So one of the beautiful aspects of this way of life is that I keep finding stories showing people moving resources from the haves to the have-nots, right? In my culture, in the United States, we have this big problem where the more money you have, the more money you get, right? The billionaires, they might make a whole $1 billion in a year, whereas people who don't have anything, they can hardly make ends meet, right? It's backwards, right? So in healthy nations in traditional times, there's ways of moving goods from the people who have to the people who don't. And one beautiful story comes from Nancy Baskett about the traditional Cherokee. She described how there was a ceremony where all the women in town would give gifts to the eldest woman, and they knew she didn't need the gifts. This sounds a little bit like a consumer economy thing, right? Giving gifts that people don't need. But check this out. The eldest woman would take responsibility to pass on the gifts to those who needed them most. It's beautiful, right? And if I was that eldest woman, I can only imagine what an honor that would be to be trusted in that way, right? To receive so much abundance and then pass it on to the people in need. And so often giving can be challenging, right? I might have more than I need, but how do I know who could use it, right? Or maybe I don't have enough, and it's hard to ask sometimes for things, right? And so what did the Cherokee do? Well, in this example, they figured out a way to move resources from the haves to the have-nots that got around some of these obstacles that can make it hard to share. Another example comes from the Tutu Hill Mayans, right? Martin Prechtel wrote this book, Secrets of the Talking Jaguar, about his time there. He was a shaman for about 10 years in the 1980s. And he said that shamans would heal the sick, and in return, they'd be given a lot of really good food. And he said it was important that the shamans fed themselves and their families from this food, but most of the food the shaman would pass on, right? They would feed the elders with it. They would give food back to the mentors who had raised them up as shamans. They would give it to the widows, to the injured, to whoever needed it, right? So the shaman, it's easy to call them like a doctor or a medicine man type person, but a major social role that they played was as a distributor of goods, right? They would take food from people who had it and they would give it to the people who didn't, right? Which sounds like that story from the Cherokee. And we're getting to some of the most beautiful stories I've found here that really touch me. Is it possible to have entire towns of people embracing the Golden Rule? Well, Nancy Baskett told a beautiful story from the traditional Cherokee. She said that towns would get too big when they started to have around 600 to 700 people, right? The hunting got hard, maybe there wasn't enough garden space, or, things were getting a little bit too cramped. And so what they would do is people would agree on a new town site about 7 miles away, right? And everyone in the town would go to the new site and build homes and to plant gardens and do everything they needed to do so that the town was ready to be lived in. And then half the people would stay and half the people would go, right? So everyone had a home, whether they moved or not, right? Each person treated the others the way they would want to be treated. If I'm the one who's leaving, I would love for my friends to help me build that home, to help me prepare that garden, right? And so whether I'm moving or not, I'd better help out. That's the golden rule on the scale of whole towns as a normal way of life. Another example comes from the Huron. French missionaries visited them starting in the early 1600s, and they noticed that the Huron had some rules, and one of them was that you were not allowed to not have a house or food, right? If you didn't have a house, they would make sure you had a house. If you were hungry, they would make sure you had food, right? They didn't let people suffer unnecessarily. And in fact, these missionaries noticed that one day in this town of Ososan, and I'm guessing at the pronunciation, but this person's house burned down. And what did the town do? They came together and they built that person a new one, right? They didn't have to take out a mortgage for 30 years. They didn't have to bicker with the insurance company. Their neighbors just came together and built them a new home. It's beautiful, right? The golden rule embraced on the scale of whole towns. It's one of the most beautiful stories I've found. It shows how even children can be mentored to have incredible generosity. And when it's hard to be generous, maybe because you don't have very much, well, then let's be brave in how we're being generous to each other. So Ohiesa described a story from the Sioux where this boy named Crazy Horse was about 4 to 5 years old in a really cold winter, and the hunting was really bad, and his father couldn't bring back any food, and people were really hungry. And finally, his father brought home 2 elk, right? So after this long stretch without food, he finally brought some home. So Crazy Horse is about 4 to 5 years old, right? A little boy. And he goes around and he invites all the old people in town over to his family's home. And he says, come get food. We have food. And he did this without asking his parents' permission, right? So you can imagine maybe being the father or the mother in that household, and you finally have enough food, and all of a sudden, all of the old people in town are coming up to your house expecting to be fed. Well, his mother dished out the food. And the way he tells the story, she only had enough after everyone else was fed. She had enough for 2 meals left, right? So she did give that food away. And the next day, little Crazy Horse came up to his mom and said he was hungry. And his mother didn't punish him. She didn't say, well, you should have asked your father and me before you went and gave away all the food. She didn't punish him, right? And she didn't shame him. She didn't say, well, you should have thought of this, right? Let this be a lesson to you. She didn't do that, right? Because she admired the generosity in her son and she wanted to encourage it. What she said was this: remember, my son, they went home singing praises in your name, not my name or your father's. You must be brave. You must live up to your reputation, right? What was she doing in telling her son this when her son is hungry? She's urging him to be brave as he faces the consequences of his generosity, right? So the problem wasn't that you were generous and now you're suffering and you shouldn't have been generous. No, being generous was the right thing. And now you need to be brave as you face the consequences, right? Because generosity is how we live with each other, right? I have a hard time telling that story without tearing up a little bit. So another beautiful pattern that I see is what I call share good news to encourage good deeds. And I'll tell you this story I found many years ago. When I first found it, I didn't understand it at all. Martin Prechtel, in this book, Secrets of the Talking Jaguar, he says, and this is about the Tsutuhil Maya in their traditional way of life, which they're able to keep until about 1990, right? So again, this isn't just thousands of years ago. This is right now or in recent times. And he says, to get anywhere in traditional Mayan society, you had to work really hard to get wealth, get appointed to office without campaigning, and then give it all away. And I read that and I was like, how does that make any sense? Right? Campaigning is how I tell people who I am. Campaigning is how I tell people what I would do if I was in office, right? So how am I supposed to get appointed or elected or whatever if I don't campaign and people don't know me? It didn't make sense. But I kept studying healthy nations and I kept reading these stories over time. And finally, I found another story that showed me what I was missing. So there's this book called When Buffalo Ran, and it's one of the biggest, most impactful books I've ever read. This American interviewed a Cheyenne man named Wikis, and he describes his boyhood and early manhood and how he was trained by his masculine mentor, his uncle. And so a lot of the book is him sharing this masculine mentorship that he got. And his uncle was training him to be a warrior, not for pride or greed, right, or fame, but to be in service of his people, right? And he said this to his nephew, Wikis. He said, if you should chance to perform any brave act, do not speak of it. Let your comrades do this. It is not for you to tell of the things that you have done. And let's look at that. Do not speak of it. Let your comrades do this. And I realized it's not my job to tell other people about all the great stuff I do, right? It's other people's job to tell stories, my good stories, right? And if it's other people's job to tell my stories, that means that it's my job to tell other people's amazing stories, right? And so I want to show how amazing this could be, even in our current way of life right now, if we could embrace this practice for ourselves. And to do that, I would love to invite Shayna back onto the video. All right. Thank you for joining me again.
Yeah.
Cool. So I thought it'd be fun to do a little exercise and see how amazing it would be if people could share each other's stories in a beautiful way. So I have a question for you. How would you feel if I got really sick and I was out of commission for a week or two? I was just lying in bed and you cooked some beautiful meals and you brought them all the way to me. You drove to my house and several times while I was sick, right? How would you feel if I never said thanks?
Not very good.
Not very good.
No, that wouldn't feel good.
You wouldn't feel good. Would you feel inclined to do that again next time I got sick?
Not really.
Not really? Dang it. No free rides, huh? Well, I have a question for you. How would you feel if I said, thank you so much. Your food was delicious and you helped me feel so much better when I was really not feeling good. And you even brought it all the way to my home multiple times. And I'm really grateful to you. How would you feel?
I'd feel great.
Right? Would you feel like if I got sick again later, would you feel like helping me again?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. And it's not just saying thanks, right? It's like pointing out the specific things, all the different ways you put in effort, right? Does that feel good where I'm calling out how good your cooking was and all the effort you put in into bringing it to my house, you know, and doing it when I'm sick, like you noticed I was sick, right? So there's like paying attention to me too. Does that feel good to have all those specific things pointed out?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that already feels pretty good. But I have a question for you. How would you feel if I also told my friends and neighbors about your generosity and your good cooking? What if this happened? What if rumors started spreading all around town so that even strangers had heard of your generosity? And maybe you're walking down the street and someone you don't even know says, "Hey, are you Shayna? I heard really good things about you." How would that feel?
I'd feel honored.
Honored, right? It'd be really cool to have people you don't even know thinking highly of you, right? And so, and you did something really beautiful, right? In cooking and bringing me food. But in the way I respond, I can help you either not want to give any more at all, or I can help you feel honored and like giving even more, right? And to me, that really shows what these other stories are about. Whoops. If we look at, if we go back to the Tsutuho Maya, well, how does someone get appointed to office without campaigning? Well, guess what? If people are telling all these beautiful stories about you, if you wanted to be a leader, people would already know, oh, Shayna, I've heard about her. She's cool. She's good, good cooking. She's generous. She's got a beautiful smile. All these reasons, right? So you'd already have a leg up if you ever wanted to serve your people in that way, right? Now, another beautiful thing, look at the Cheyenne example. Shayna doesn't have to brag about herself. She doesn't have to go around and say, hey, I'm a good cook.
I'll take care of you when you're sick.
Yeah, she doesn't have to tell people, hey, I'm really generous. She doesn't have to tell people these things. They find out without you having to brag, right? Mm-hmm. Right? Because I'm bragging for her, right? And all the people, maybe other people do this. And so now you have all these people in your life that you're touching in a beautiful way, telling these beautiful stories about you and lifting up your reputation without you having to do anything else except give. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Absolutely.
It'd be so beautiful, right? Cool. Thank you so much for joining me again. Another common pattern that I find in every healthy nation in traditional times that I've ever looked at is that people don't just live in reciprocity with each other, right? They don't just share with each other over time. They also live in reciprocity with the earth, right? They receive the gifts of the earth, and they also give gifts back to the earth so that they actually benefit the earth where they live. So Jeanette Armstrong was an Okanagan woman, and in this talk, she described their traditional decision-making process. And I only read the text of it. I didn't get to hear her, so I have to speculate on exactly how this is pronounced. But my best guess is Inaukenwix. And it's this traditional decision-making process, and she described the major features of it. And I want to share those with you to show how the whole community or the whole nation could take the Earth's needs into account when they made important decisions. She said that the first most important point was the voice of the minority, right? If most people want one thing, but a few people want something else, well, let's listen to them, right? Maybe they see something that most people don't. And in this way, you don't have to worry about being in the minority, right? If you think of elections, I don't want to be in the minority because then other people get to choose the leaders and I have to obey the laws passed by leaders I don't like, right? But if you take the voice of the minority into account, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about losing the election, right? Because everyone's voice is taken into account. And she described that they speak for the land. And Jeanette Armstrong said that she was actually trained to be a land speaker. And so it was her job to consider the perspective of the non-humans. How would this decision, whatever decision the group is considering, how would the different options affect the land? How would the land look in a generation or several generations? And it was her role in that decision-making group to bring forth those perspectives. Another major aspect that she talks about is human relationships, right? What are the needs of mothers, and how are mothers going to be impacted with these different options we're considering? What do the elders need? What do the workers need, right? Whatever groups of people might be impacted, what would the impacts be? And how can we take all of these consequences into account to make the best decisions we can? The last one that she brings up is creativity, right? Because it's important that we're not just talking about business all the time, but it's important to enjoy life and enjoy each other. And so creativity is an important thing that she talked about, right? Maybe we can address our problems in creative ways. Maybe we can make sure, right, that we're living in the most fully satisfying way possible, right, with creativity. And she described what happens when an entire community or an entire nation can live in a way where they're embracing all of these perspectives. She said, something happens inside where the material things don't have a lot of meaning, where material wealth and the securing of it, or being fearful and being frightened about not having things to sustain you, disappears, right? And my interpretation, right, is you don't even need to be selfish because you can trust the people around you to take care of you and take care of each other in difficult times, just like they are trusting you, right? When everyone has that trust, I don't need to get rich anymore. I don't need to hoard my stuff anymore, right? Because if I'm ever in need, I know that other people will take care of me, just like I would take care of them, right? And so you don't have to be fearful and frightened about not having things. And this is just one of many of these examples I've found that shows that this way of life is real. And that if I and many other people can learn lessons from this, they could help us build our own healthy nation. And so, if we wanted to co create a healthy nation where sharing is normal, I believe it would take many things, but one of them is that we need to build friend groups in communities where sharing is normal, right? If we want this to be our way of life, it's got to start with us and build up from there. And so I want to offer some things that I've been doing in my life, many of which come from these stories I'm sharing you as inspiration, as a way to hopefully inspire other folks who want to build this way with me. So one possibility is to form friend groups that regularly share with each other, right? That help each other when someone's in need. One example that I really enjoy is I live a little bit out in the woods, and a lot of times, a lot of my friends are homesteaders, right? But it's a lot of work to manage a big garden and manage your house and keep your job and all these different pressures, parenting, you know? And so what we'll do is we'll go around as a group to one person's house, and everyone works on the garden together. Or maybe half of us work on the garden and half of us put up a new outhouse or some other project, right? And so it's hard to manage a homestead yourself, even if you have a full family. But if you can have all of your friends come by for a day or maybe longer, it gets a lot easier, right? Or another thing that I haven't done this particular one, but I have friends that do, is they're part of a group that everyone puts in money into a pot every month, and that collected savings grows consistently. And all of a sudden, this group has a lot of money where together they can decide how to spend it. Does one of them have a kid that wants to go to trade school? Well, now you have a pot of money as a group that you could use to support this person. If someone's house is like the roof is leaking, well, now you have money that you can use. Or maybe you want to donate it to a good cause, right? But we have this shared resource that now we can use to do whatever good we can think to do, right? This one is big. Care for, mentor, and be invested in each other's kids. So, yeah, one thing I've learned, if you have a nuclear family with two parents and everyone's healthy and engaged, parenting is really time consuming and challenging. And it only gets more time consuming and challenging, if you have one parent or you have health problems or financial problems, like it only gets compounding how difficult it is. And I'm not a parent, but I'm considering it, and it may happen soon. One of my biggest fears is having my life consumed with parenting duties. I obviously want to care for my kids, but I have other things that are important to me too. And it would be a lot less concerning if other people were deeply invested in my kids, and it was like the entire parenting burden didn't fall on me. And if I was deeply invested in their kids. And so I'm not a parent, but I'm working on that now. And I just want to throw out some ideas that I've developed that have been really meaningful for me, and I think for some of my friends that are parents and for kids. And I want to start by saying, like, nothing I say here is like underhanded. There's no secrets. There's no, like, everything is with consent. Kids consent, parents consent. Um, and, everyone's aware and approving of everything. But so one thing that's worked for me is looking for ways to mentor. And so, I have a lot of my friends will have adult friends will have like 2 or 3 or 4 kids. They're siblings, and they'll fight with each other every so often. And I'll often notice they're not great at setting boundaries. They don't know how they feel. They don't say how they feel respectfully. They like normal problems. And so I you know, invite them to learn those things. Like, I will help them know how they feel, find respectful ways of expressing themselves, find ways of setting boundaries instead of just tolerating hurtful behavior, find ways of doing the things I talk about in the series. Um, Another thing is playing fun games with the kids that get them away from the computer screens, right? That teach body awareness or physical resilience. I have one kid friend, he's like 4 years old, and he loves to be strong. And so I figured out this fun rock playing game that he and I play. And we're both throwing rocks. Mine's much bigger than his. But I'm teaching him body awareness and, actual strength training as a young kid in a safe way. So, yeah, teaching fire safety, teaching knife safety. Um, Again, with the parents' permission and awareness, and with the kids' permission, right? Like, I'm never forcing anything on anybody, but no one likes being insecure or unskilled. And what I found is that kids often want to contribute, and maybe they're scared, or they have low self confidence, or they just don't know how. And so, if I can notice that urge to contribute to the family somehow, often I can help maybe teach something that would help them do that. Um, a big one is helping kids consider what's important to them. A lot of times school is about memorization, follow the teacher's rules, right? You go to school when you don't want to, oftentimes, in all these ways it's not really supportive. And so I help the kids. I ask them, like, what's important to you? Like, what skills would you want to learn? How do you want to contribute to the people around you? What's important to you? And I build up that sense that they matter and that their choices matter. And often will help them, like, learn something cool. So yeah, the mentoring is a big one. Another is, helping out if someone's going through a hard time, if a parent is sick or if a kid is sick, bringing over food, you know, asking ahead of time, obviously. Um, and then another one, just generally being invested in the kids' well-being. If they're struggling in school, sometimes it's hard to figure out why. And so it's helpful to have multiple people, and I'll just end up asking the kid and, like, practicing my listening skills, what's going on, and I'll notice what I can and offer feedback, and often it can be helpful. If they're being bullied, build up their self-confidence, maybe teach them self-defense, which also builds their self-confidence. Role play with different scenarios to help them deal with the situation in a more constructive way by practicing it can be really powerful. Maybe helping them find an internship as they grow older. So again, all these are with a parent's approval and support, right? This is nothing secretive or, um, not okay about any of this stuff, but it's ways of, like, forming friendships with the parents that I'm already friends with, and then forming friendships with the kids and being invested in them, caring for them, and with, not doing it in order to receive something, but also wanting to build these reciprocal relationships, right? Where I'm invested in other people's kids and they're invested in my kids, even though I don't have any yet, but wanting to build this way of life over time for myself and the people around me. And so I think this can be a powerful one for anyone else that also wants to build these intentional, mutually enriching relationships. So another thing is physically taking care of each other's homes. I love that example from the Huron, right? They don't let people be homeless. And if someone's house burned down, they built them a new one, right? And yeah, it's hard to build someone a house from scratch, especially because we have this system of private property land ownership that makes it really hard to take unused land and build a small home on it, right? But there are still a lot of ways that we could help each other, right? If you think about a leaky roof and how expensive that can be to fix, or, the costs of having poor insulation, right? And the large heating and cooling bills, or the troubles that come with bad water quality, right? These are problems that a friend group could help each other with, right? If someone is a roofing expert or another person knows about insulation, right? Maybe there's plumbing problems, but if the group funded one of the kids to go to plumbing school, maybe that kid could take care of their plumbing, right? So there's all these ways of being creative and helping each other out. Another big thing, right? I loved all these stories about sharing food and helping each other eat well. And one thing I've seen a lot and done a lot in my life is personal gardening, shared gardening, community gardening, and guerrilla gardening. If you don't know what guerrilla gardening is, I don't have time to get into it right now, but it's so much fun. So I urge you to look into it. There's also foraging, work trading on organic farms. There's all these different ways. And I want to put in a plug for work trading on organic farms. I've done this a bunch, and I commonly find that organic farmers, or really any farmers I talk to, often don't like using work traders. And what I hear commonly is that they don't show up on time and they don't work very hard. And so what most farmers I talk to want is reliable help. And I have found that if I show up on time and if I work hard, that I can get a lot of high quality organic produce. And when I look at the cost of this box or boxes of produce that I bring home, and I compare it to how much money I would need to make it a job to get the same amount of food in the store, well, it was a lot more efficient to work on the farm, right? And then I have a lot of organic food I can share with other people. And so I know this doesn't work for a lot of people. People might live in food deserts or have other obstacles. And so I'm not saying every point works for everybody. I'm just offering ideas as inspiration to show what's possible if we could take creativity and build these deep relationships where we're actively looking for ways to take care of each other and get through hard times together. Another point is serving the earth together, right? If we're going to eat from the ground and grow food from the soil, we better give back to the soil, right? I have a friend, when he started farming, he farmed on bare clay, right? The ground was orange. 20 years later, he has over a foot of topsoil, beautiful, rich loam. And so even though he is farmed, right, he pulls plants out of the ground, he adds so much nutrients in that there's more soil because he was there while he was farming from it, right? So it's possible for us to leave the earth better off. Other things we can do, protect the forests, right? Protect the rivers. And building habitat for birds or bears or deer, whatever animals that we want to build the abundance around us. We can give back in this way. In all of this, whatever ways we find in creative ways, with the ultimate goal that within the friend group or community, trust becomes normal. Now, you might object and say, you know what, sharing is beautiful, but there's a lot more to trust than sharing with each other. And I agree with that, right? If we think back to that exercise at the beginning during the review section, what are all the ways that a trustworthy person would need to be trustworthy in order to be totally trustworthy, right? Sharing is one, but there are a lot of others. There's telling the truth, there's acting in service, there's keeping promises, there's seeking the truth, right? And so if we wanted to have relationships in communities and eventually a nation where trust is normal, I believe we need to learn or remember how to have high standards, right? How to make trustworthy behavior normal, not just in sharing, but in all those different ways. And that's the theme of the third video. How can we have high standards and make trustworthy behavior normal? So I'd love for you to join me in that one. After that will be the fourth video. The theme will be pathways to a healthy nation, right? This isn't just theoretical. This way of life is real, and we could live this. And what I want to offer are stories of people who have been in similar situations, right? Oh, lots and lots of violence, corruption and greed, all kinds of problems. And they still came together and they built a healthy nation where they wouldn't have those problems, right? Where people take care of each other and they take care of the earth, right? So they show that it is possible. And that's session 4. So every session will stand on its own. Each one will start with a review. And if you would like to see any more of these videos, they're available at thedeepestrevolution.com/videos. So that's the end of my presentation. The material that I'm sharing is also in my book, The Deepest Revolution. It's available as a free download. And there's also a physical version that you can buy too. If you'd like to contact me to speak in a group or collaborate together in some way or facilitate building trust, you can reach me at thedeepestrevolution.com/contact. And if you'd like to see more videos, they're available at thedeepestrevolution.com/videos. Thank you very much.